The Inheritance of Silence. The night Elizabeth first heard the whispers, the Virginia air was heavy with the smell of dying leaves and chimney smoke. She lay awake in the old guest chamber of Merriwick Manor, staring at the ceiling beams that creaked like shifting bones in the wind. The manor had always unsettled her. Its windows seemed too narrow, its corridors too long, its portraits too watchful. But it wasn't the house that woke her. It was the sound. Voices carried through, the floorboards low and deliberate, as if secrets themselves had taken on human tongues. She pressed her ear to the cold floor. Her guardian's voice, measured, commanding with that peculiar note of satisfaction she had come to dread, rose in rhythm with another, a lawyer perhaps, someone whose tone oiled each word as though greased with money. They spoke of contracts, of marriage, of her future. And then, with a pause that made her blood turn colder than the November frost, her name. Not as Elizabeth, not even as Miss Hartwell, but as the girl. A possession. A promise. That was the moment Elizabeth understood. Her life was not her own. The roots of Merriwick Manor stood on a rise above the James River, its brick face blackened by decades of damp, its chimneys rising like watchtowers over the Uai, surrounding tobacco fields. The house had been built in the 1740s, when Virginia's aristocracy was still flexing its New World power, and every brick had been hauled by enslaved men whose names no Caldwell ever recorded. To outsiders, it was a monument of prosperity. To those who lived within, it was a fortress and a cage. Her guardian, Silas Caldwell, had inherited the estate under dubious circumstances. The whispers in Henrico taverns told of a will rewritten at midnight, a sickly brother smothered before dawn, and a widow who vanished into silence before the courts could ask questions. Yet in the Commonwealth's eyes, none of it mattered. Silas Caldwell stood at the head of one of Virginia's most powerful dynasties, untouched, unchallenged, and perhaps most dangerously, unquestioned. Elizabeth had been placed in his care after the accident, though accident was too kind a word. A carriage overturned, her parents dead, and she, at barely 11 years old, spared only by a fluke of chance. She had been told often that she was fortunate to be taken in by Caldwell, as if fortune could ever be confused with captivity. Q. Mask of fatherhood, Silas played his role with chilling precision. To neighbors, he was the benevolent widower, a man too devoted to the memory of his late wife to remarry, yet kind enough to open his home to an orphan. To Elizabeth, he was something else entirely. At first, she mistook his attentions for paternal care. He provided tutors, books, fine gowns. He taught her French phrases at the dinner table, had her practice ledgers with plantation accounts, and praised her sharpness of wit. He called her my dear child, with the tenderness of any doting father. But there were moments, small, hairline cracks where the mask slipped, the way his hand lingered too long on her shoulder when guiding her through the hall, the way his eyes hardened when she asked about her uncle in Maryland, the way he watched her not as a father might, but as a man planning the future of property he owned. By 14, she had stopped calling him Papa. By 15, she stopped, trusting the kindness in his voice. The law in his favor in 18th century Virginia, the law was not designed to protect girls like Elizabeth. Guardianship granted men near absolute authority. Adoption was rare, but once secured, it made her legally bound to him until marriage transferred her rights to another man. What Elizabeth didn't know, what she only overheard that November night, was that Silas Caldwell had arranged for both roles to belong to him. Down in the study, the voices spoke of consolidation, of keeping blood and land intact. Words that sounded harmless in legal tone but dripped with implications Elizabeth felt in her bones. There was mention of a contract already signed, of magistrates too loyal, or too afraid, to question its oddities. Then came her name again, paired with the word bride. Her throat tightened. A shiver traced her spine as though invisible fingers had pressed there. A house of secrets. The days that followed were worse than the whispers. Silas was careful, even gentler than usual. He brought her a necklace that had belonged to his wife, a delicate chain of pearls. He told her she was becoming the very image of Catherine, and he began, with calculated subtlety, to isolate her further. Letters she wrote to distant relatives never reached their destination. Her tutor, Miss Lorimer, who had encouraged her to apply for a teaching post in Williamsburg, was dismissed without explanation. Servants who spoke kindly to her were reassigned or sold, and each night, Silas worked later in his study, scratching away at papers she was never allowed to see. But Elizabeth had grown sharper than he realized. One evening, while delivering a tray of wine to the study, she glimpsed a folded document, left carelessly on the desk. Only 3 words caught her eye before he noticed her and dismissed her with a smile that never touched his eyes. Marriage settlement. Caldwell. The portrait. The first true horror arrived with the portrait. One morning, Silas summoned her to the great hall, where a covered canvas leaned against the hearth. With a flourish, he revealed the painting. A man in formal attire, severe jawline, steel gray eyes bearing an uncanny resemblance to Silas himself, though younger, smoother, almost idealized. "You're intended," he said softly, as though confiding a secret too sacred for others. A cousin from the western counties, a match most fitting. Elizabeth stared at the painted man, her heart hammering with confusion. His name, Silas explained, was Jonathan Caldwell. He was away on business but would return soon. Their union, he promised, would unite the family lines, preserve the estate, and ensure her future. But Elizabeth's eyes had already betrayed her reason. The brushstrokes around the mouth, the tilt of the head, the steel gray eyes, all were familiar. Too familiar. She had seen that face across the dining table every evening. She had heard that voice instruct her in French verbs and plantation ledgers. The portrait was not of some distant cousin. It was of Silas himself. Elizabeth excused herself, claiming a sudden faintness. She stumbled back to her room, the image seared into her vision, her stomach twisting with dread. For the first time, she knew without doubt, whatever plans Silas Caldwell had for her, they were not the plans of a father, and the marriage he spoke of, her marriage, was not to a cousin at all. It was to him. The paper chains. The portrait haunted Elizabeth's sleep. She would wake gasping in the night, convinced the painted man had stepped out of his frame and was watching her from the corner of the room. When she shut her eyes, she saw Silas's face bleeding through the oil paint, smiling with that cold, practiced patience it was no longer enough to suspect. She needed to know, and knowledge in Merriwick Manor was more dangerous than fire in dry tobacco. The locked drawer. The study was Silas's kingdom. Heavy walnut desk, shelves sagging with law books, a map of Virginia pinned in gold tacks. Elizabeth had been trained to keep accounts there, but she was never allowed to linger once her tasks were done. One damp afternoon, while Silas met with an overseer in the fields, she slipped inside. Her heart raced in her throat, each tick of the mantel clock a hammer striking guilt against her ribs. The desk had drawers. Most opened easily, yielding neat rows of letters, ledgers, and receipts. But the bottom right, brass-handled, scarred, by use, was locked. Elizabeth hesitated only a moment. She had once watched Martha, the house servant, coax an old cupboard open with nothing but a hairpin. Elizabeth had practiced the trick since, in secret. Now her trembling fingers pressed the pin into the lock, praying the tumblers would shift. A faint click. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a collection of documents tied with crimson ribbon. She untied them with hands that trembled so violently, she feared the paper would tear. First her adoption papers, neat in Cornelius Vance's hand. But there was something wrong. The ink near the signatures had bled, as though touched by water, or altered after drying. The date, too, seemed scraped and overwritten. Next, a second document, folded with precise care. She opened it. Marriage. Settlement between Silas Caldwell of Merriwick Manor, Henrico County, and Elizabeth Hartwell, his adopted ward. Her blood ran cold. There was no cousin, no distant Jonathan Caldwell. The groom was named plainly, without disguise. A floorboard groaned outside the door. Elizabeth shoved the papers back into the drawer, relocked it, and slipped out the side door into the hall. Her pulse thundered so loudly she could barely hear her own footsteps. Gaslight and kindness. That evening, Silas was at his most affectionate. He praised her embroidery at dinner. He recited scripture about loyal daughters and dutiful wives. When she asked cautiously about her uncle, he dismissed the question with a smile. "My dear," he said, swirling his wine, "family is not who shares your blood, but who safeguards your future. Who better to guard yours than I?" Elizabeth kept her gaze lowered, her spoon trembling in her hand. He was testing her. He suspected. Later, as he bid her goodnight, his hand lingered too long on her hair, smoothing it as though she were still a child. But his eyes were not a father's eyes. They were calculating, possessive, like a man admiring land he intended to fence. Martha's warning it was Martha, the house's oldest servant, who gave her the first crack of hope. "Miss Lizzie," Martha whispered one night while tending the fire in Elizabeth's chamber, "you mustn't let Master know how sharp you are. A clever bird in a cage gets its wings clipped." Elizabeth caught her wrist. "You know something." The woman's face tightened, her eyes darting toward the door. "I seen too much. Papers, visitors at odd hours, things a young lady shouldn't know. He don't mean you harm, not the way you think, but he means to keep you, his body and soul. You hear me? His." The fire crackled. Shadows danced. Elizabeth's breath caught. "Then I must get out." Martha shook her head. "There ain't no out. The walls don't keep you in, the law does." The phantom cousin Silas, sensing her doubts, staged a performance. One morning, a letter arrived, sealed in green wax. He presented it at breakfast, pretending surprise. "A word from our cousin Jonathan," he said, breaking the seal. He read aloud in a voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "My dear kinsman, I rejoice at the union you propose. Though distant, I feel as if fate itself has brought our branches together." Elizabeth stared at the script. It was too familiar. The same curving hand that signed plantation receipts, the same flourish at every C. Silas looked up, studying her reaction. "A most proper gentleman, don't you think?" Her spoon clattered against her bowl. She forced a smile, but inside terror bloomed. He wasn't hiding the lie anymore. He was daring her to see it. Firelight revelation. That night she could not sleep. The house creaked and sighed, and the portrait in the great hall seemed almost alive in the moonlight. She crept down again past the cold hearth into the study. This time she did not open the drawer. She went to the shelf where Silas kept his ledgers. Pulling one free, she flipped through, tracing neat columns of numbers. Wages paid, land purchased, debts collected. Then, an entry that stopped her breath. Payment to S. Bigham for services, rendered on the Richmond Road. Richmond Road. The very place her parents' carriage had overturned. Her hands went numb. The ink blurred as tears stung her eyes. It had not been an accident. The man who raised her, who called her daughter, had paid for their deaths. The floor creaked behind her. A shadow stretched across the page. "Up so late, my dear?" Silas's voice slid through the dark, warm as honey, cold as the grave. The cage without bars. Elizabeth did not scream when she turned and found Silas standing in the study doorway. His face, lit only by the fire's last embers, seemed carved from stone, the steel-gray eyes gleaming like blades. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. Her hand trembled, on the ledger. She closed it slowly, as if she had only been idly paging through. "I could not sleep," she said, steadying her voice. "I thought perhaps a book might help." Silas smiled. Small, controlled, a smile that never touched the eyes. A restless mind, just like Catherine's. He stepped forward, took the ledger from her fingers and slid it back into its place on the shelf. But books are dangerous in the wrong hands. Numbers especially. They make people think too much. Elizabeth bowed her head. Inside, her heart was beating like a bird battering its wings against a cage. The new rules, the next morning, new restrictions appeared without announcement. The key to the study disappeared from its usual hook. Servants who once spoke freely with Elizabeth now kept their eyes down, fearful of unseen ears. Her walks in the orchard were shortened, always with a watchful maid in tow. Silas, meanwhile, was gentler than ever. He brought her books of poetry, asked her to read aloud, praised the sweetness of her voice. He gave her Catherine's locket, whispering that it was fitting she should wear what belonged to the mistress of Marrowick. It was kindness sharpened into a blade, meant to cut away resistance. Elizabeth smiled when he looked at her, nodded at his words, and let him believe she was softening. But behind her eyes she was cataloguing every door, every locked chest, every careless phrase he let slip. Martha's secret: it was Martha who gave her the crack of hope again. The old servant found her in the scullery, hands still damp from rinsing dishes. "He's got men watching you, miss," Martha whispered. "But men can be bribed with coin, and I got coin tucked where master don't look." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Martha, if you help me, I've been here longer than him," Martha said firmly, her voice like gravel. "I seen wives vanish, papers rewritten, children sent off never to be seen again. You're the last chance this house has to spit him out like the rot he is." She pressed something small and cold into Elizabeth's palm. "A key." "Cellar door," Martha said. "There's things down there he don't want seen. If you find them, don't keep them. Hide them somewhere he'll never think to look." The cellar that night, Elizabeth crept down into the manor's bowels. The stone steps wept with damp, the air thick with mold and earth. Her candle flickered against racks of wine bottles and old barrels, but beyond them, a second door waited. Key turned smoothly. Hinges groaned. Inside was not a storage room, but an archive. Bundles of letters tied in string, a trunk filled with legal documents, and, chillingly, a small chest containing a woman's diary, its leather cover cracked, its clasp broken. Catherine's diary. Elizabeth opened it with shaking hands. The entries began ordinary. Notes about the estate, mentions of fevers among the slaves, anxieties about childbirth. But then, the tone changed. "Silas grows colder by the day. I fear he has plans for me that no wife should dread of her husband. I have seen powders in his desk, white as snow, bitter as wormwood. He sprinkles it in my wine when he thinks I do not see." Elizabeth's breath caught. Catherine had not died in childbirth, she had been poisoned. The candle sputtered. A draught swept the room. Elizabeth turned, and there, in the doorway, stood Silas. The mask breaks. He did not rage. He did not strike. Instead, he stepped into the room with terrifying calm, his shadow stretching long across the stone floor. "So," he said softly, "you found Catherine's voice. How curious that she whispers to you from the grave." Elizabeth clutched the diary to her chest. Her pulse thundered. "You killed her." Silas tilted his head, studying her like a physician studying a specimen. "She was unfit to carry my vision, too fragile, too suspicious. But you are different. Stronger, smarter. You've proved it tonight." He stepped closer, the damp air shivering with his presence. "That is why you must be both daughter and wife. The only one worthy of such a role. The only one who can carry." The Caldwell name forward without taint. Elizabeth's voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "I will never be your wife." Silas's smile returned, thin as a knife. "Oh, my dear. You already are. The law has said it. The papers are signed. You may resist, you may weep, but paper chains bind tighter than iron." He reached out, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand, and whispered, "The wedding is in 12 days. Elizabeth stumbled back, clutching the diary, but his hand closed on her wrist with iron force. "Run if you wish," he said. "Cry for help. No one will believe you. To them, you are my ward, my daughter, and soon, my bride. Every document says so. Every court will say so. Do you know what they'll call you if you protest? His smile widened, monstrous in the candlelight. They will call you mad. And with that, he blew out her candle, plunging the cellar into suffocating dark. The stranger at the gate on the morning frost of November 3rd, the rhythm of Merriwick Manor changed. A sound broke through the stillness of the tobacco fields. The creak of wagon wheels, the weary snort of a horse, and the hollow knock of a cane against the stones of the drive. Elizabeth, pale from a sleepless night, watched from an upstairs window as a man approached the gates. He was older, 50 perhaps, with graying hair and the stooped shoulders of one who had spent his life on the road. His clothes were worn but respectable, his manner that of someone used to entering strangers' homes not as a guest, but as a servant of God. A minister. Her heart stuttered. Ministers meant records. Baptisms, marriages, burials. Ministers knew family names, family histories. They could speak truths that forged documents could not, and he was walking toward her prison. Reverend Hartley Silas received the traveler at the steps with exaggerated warmth, as though Providence itself had sent him. "Reverend Hartley, you honor us," Silas said, his voice smooth, his hand clasping the minister's as though sealing a bargain. "Merriwick has been lonely of late. You shall dine with us tonight, and perhaps share the word tomorrow for our household." Elizabeth lingered in the hall's shadows, her breath shallow. Hartley's eyes, lined with age and miles, swept past Silas and landed on her. Something flickered there, recognition perhaps, or simple curiosity. At dinner, beneath portraits of stern Caldwells, the Reverend spoke of his journeys, parishes scattered across Virginia, families rising and falling, children baptized, wives buried. His voice was gentle but threaded with authority that came not from wealth but from years of watching men and their secrets. Elizabeth sat silent, absorbing every syllable. And then, with trembling courage, she asked the question that burned her tongue. "Reverend, do you know of the Hartwells of Norfolk?" A name remembered. The table fell silent. Silas's fork paused above his plate, his eyes narrowing. But Reverend Hartley's face softened with recognition. "Indeed I do, child. William and Margaret Hartwell. Fine people. I baptized their daughter, Elizabeth, when she was just a babe in arms." He smiled wistfully. "A bright child," they said, "bound for great things." Elizabeth's breath caught, tears pricking at her eyes. Here was proof. Proof she was not Silas's to command. But she dared not show too much. Silas's gaze was upon her, heavy as iron. "They perished in a carriage accident," Silas cut in smoothly, "and their daughter was blessed to be placed in my care." Hartley's brow furrowed. "Strange. I was told they meant to take the child west, to live with kin in the Kentucky territories. Margaret's brother, Thomas Whitfield. He has sought word for years, grieved terribly, thinking all lost." The Reverend's eyes met Elizabeth's across the table. He saw her blanch, saw her knuckles whiten around her glass. His voice gentled. "Perhaps, my dear, you are not as alone in the world as you thought." Silas's counterplay. Silas laughed. Too quickly, too sharp. "Reverend, rumors scatter like leaves in autumn. This Thomas Whitfield has surely been misinformed. The girl is my ward. The records prove it. And in 12 days, she shall be wed into our family line, her future secure." The Reverend stiffened, uneasy. "Wed? At so tender an age, to whom?" Silas's eyes glittered like glass in candlelight. "To a kinsman, a most appropriate match. One need not trouble a child with tedious details of law and lineage. What matters is that Providence has preserved her." Elizabeth forced her face to stillness, though her heart screamed. She caught the Reverend's eyes again, begging silently, "See me, help me." He said nothing more that evening. But when Silas stepped away after the meal to instruct the overseer, Hartley leaned closer to her across the table. "My child," he whispered, "you are Elizabeth Hartwell, and you are not without kin." The diary as weapon that night. Elizabeth retrieved Catherine's diary from its hiding place beneath her mattress. She traced the words again: poison, powders, fear, then closed it with new resolve. The Reverend was her chance. But to convince him, to risk his help, she would need proof. More than a diary. More than suspicion. She would need the papers, Silas, guarded as though they were crown jewels. She thought of Martha's warning. Hide them where he'll never think to look. Her mind raced. A plan began to take shape. A terrifying gift. The next morning, Silas presented her with a gown. Ivory silk, embroidered with pearls. Catherine's wedding dress altered to fit her frame. Try it on, he said, his tone deceptively soft. Let us see how radiant a Caldwell bride can be. Elizabeth's stomach turned, but she obeyed, slipping into the gown, the fabric heavy as a shroud. In the mirror, she saw not a bride, but a prisoner dressed for execution. Silas stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his reflection looming over hers. Perfect, he murmured, as though it were made for you. In 12 days, Elizabeth, you will stand before God and man as both daughter and wife, and no one, no reverend, no phantom uncle, will undo what has been written. His fingers tightened on her shoulder. In the mirror, she forced a smile, but in her mind a single thought burned like fire. Unless I strike first. The bride's rebellion. The days leading to the wedding blurred together in a suffocating haze. Servants whispered. The overseer lingered. Too long in corridors, and Silas prowled the halls with the quiet certainty of a man who believed the game already won. But Elizabeth was no longer the frightened ward. She was a strategist, and she had exactly 11 days to build her war. The first theft, she began with small risks. Each morning, when Silas walked the fields, she slipped into his study under the pretense of continuing her accounts. The locked drawer had betrayed itself to her once. She would make it yield again. Inside were the documents that chained her life, the guardianship, the marriage settlement, the correspondence with Cornelius Vance. She dared not take them whole. Silas would notice. Instead, she copied. Late at night, by candlelight, she traced signatures, replicated lines, and recorded dates in a neat secret hand. The copies she slid between the pages of Catherine's diary. The originals she returned precisely as she had found them. By the third night, her hand ached, her eyes burned, but she had assembled a portfolio of proof that could damn him. Martha's disguise. It was Martha who gave her the means to hide it. You keep them here, he'll find them. The old woman muttered, peering at the diary. Men like him, they sniff secrets out like hounds. She pulled from beneath her skirts a small sewing basket. At the bottom, under spools of thread and dull needles, lay a hidden pocket. We'll stitch your papers inside the hem of your wedding gown, Martha whispered. He won't think to look there. Too proud of his own illusion. Elizabeth's stomach twisted at the thought of wearing the gown at all. But the irony struck her. Proof of his crimes, sewn into the very costume of his triumph. She nodded. Do it. Silas's suspicion, but Silas, ever perceptive, sensed change in her. You are quieter these days, he observed one evening as they walked the orchard path. His hand hovered at the small of her back, guiding her like a shepherd steering a lamb. Have you resigned yourself at last to the destiny God has written? Elizabeth forced her lips into a smile. I have been reflecting. Silas studied her, eyes narrowing just enough to chill her marrow. Reflection is dangerous for women. It makes them believe choice exists. Choice is a burden I will not place upon you, my dear. Elizabeth inclined her head meekly, but inside, her rage blazed. You may strip me of choice, but not of will. Her boldest move came on the 7th night before the wedding. Slipping into the Reverend's chamber under cover of dark, she pressed the diary and one copied document into his hands. Read, she whispered, and believe. Hartley's eyes, shadowed by candlelight, grew wide as he traced Catherine's words, then the forged marriage settlement. His lips moved in prayer. Child, he said hoarsely. This is sin upon sin. With this, the courts must act. Elizabeth's grip tightened on his sleeve. Then you must carry it. If I am caught, it will be burned. Take it beyond these walls. Promise me. Hartley nodded solemnly. I will leave before dawn. God's hand will guide me. For the first time in years, hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest. The trap but Silas was already moving. At breakfast, he mentioned casually, Our dear Reverend departs this morning. A pity his horse went lame in the night. The overseer will escort him only as far as the river crossing. Elizabeth's spoon froze in her hand. She glanced at Hartley, who sat pale and silent, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Silas's eyes gleamed as they flicked between them. You two have grown fond, I think. How touching. But dangerous, for fondness breeds secrets. Elizabeth forced a laugh. He has been kind, nothing more. Silas smiled, but there was no mirth in it. Only warning. The cage tightens that night. Elizabeth found her chamber door locked from the outside. The windows were barred. The fire had burned low, leaving the air cold and heavy. On her dressing table lay the gown, spread out as though in mockery. Pearls gleamed in the dim light, the stitched hem hiding the diary and its damning papers. And beside it, a note in Silas's elegant hand. In 6 days, you shall wear this, and you shall be mine. Should you think to flee, remember, your minister's safety depends on your obedience. Elizabeth's knees buckled. He knew. He had always known. But as she stared at the gown, at the hidden weapon sewn into its fabric, a grim resolve hardened in her chest. If Silas wanted her dressed as a bride, then let the wedding be his undoing. The wedding of ashes. The morning of November 15th dawned gray, the sky low and bruised, the manor shrouded in mist. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward Elizabeth as she was dressed in the ivory gown, pearls woven into her hair. She looked to any observer like a bride trembling from nerves, but beneath the silk, sewn into the hem, her weapon waited. Catherine's diary, copied settlements, and proof of murder disguised as stitches. Each breath felt like a countdown. The king, gathering the great hall, had been dressed for triumph. Silver candlesticks gleamed on long tables. Portraits of Caldwell ancestors seemed to lean from the walls in witness. Guests assembled, magistrates, planters, their powdered wigs nodding in approval of Silas's wealth. Cornelius Vance, smug, in his black coat, arranged legal papers on a side table. At the front stood Reverend Hartley, his face grave, his hands trembling slightly as he opened his prayer book. He had not escaped as promised. Silas had seen to that, and then Silas himself appeared. Dressed in a coat of midnight blue, he looked every inch the patriarch, his eyes bright with possession. He offered Elizabeth his arm, guiding her forward, as though leading a lamb to the altar. The ceremony, the Reverend began. Familiar words filled the hall. Vows, scripture, talk of sacred union. Guests leaned in, their unease soothed by ritual. Elizabeth's heart hammered. At each line, honor and obey, till death do you part, she felt the net drawing tighter. Silas's hand rested over hers, firm, unyielding, and then the moment came. If any here can show just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined, let him speak now, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The hall hushed. A breathless silence. Elizabeth stepped forward. I must speak, she said, her voice clear, carrying to every ear. I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of this man. I am Elizabeth Hartwell, and he is the murderer of my parents. The unmasking gasps erupted. Silas tightened his grip on her arm, hissing, Silence! But Elizabeth wrenched free. From the hem of her gown she pulled the diary, the papers, scattering them like white petals across the stone floor. Read, she cried, voice breaking, but fierce. Here is his hand, his contracts, his poisons, his plans. He killed his wife Catherine. He forged my guardianship. He has groomed me for this moment, so he might claim me as both daughter and bride. The guests surged forward, lifting the papers, their eyes widening as they traced Silas's unmistakable hand. Murmurs rose to shouts. "Forgery!" Silas thundered, his voice cracking with fury. "Lies! She is hysterical, poisoned by doubt." But Reverend Hartley lifted Catherine's diary, his voice shaking with righteous fire. "I knew William and Margaret Hartwell. I baptized their child. And I swear before God and this assembly, this girl is she." The child thought dead 13 years. The room tilted. Order broke. The fall of Silas Caldwell magistrates moved, seizing Silas by the arms. He struggled like a beast in a trap, his face crimson, spittle at his lips. "You fools," he roared. "The law is mine. The courts are mine. This estate is mine." But the papers lay plain, the witnesses many, the Reverend's testimony irrefutable. His empire of deception collapsed in a single moment, exposed by the very ceremony he had crafted as his triumph. Elizabeth stood trembling, the gown heavy with sweat and tears. For the first time, Silas looked small, cornered, broken, his grandeur stripped bare. "You will never escape me," he spat, eyes locked on hers even as they dragged him away. "Even in the grave, you are mine." Ashes and aftermath, the trial, came swiftly. Testimonies stacked like bricks, the evidence undeniable. Silas Caldwell was condemned. Murder, fraud, abduction, attempted incestuous union. His hanging in Richmond drew crowds who once bowed at his table. Elizabeth, though vindicated, bore scars deeper than law could heal. She never married. Instead, she turned her inheritance toward orphan schools, places where children might grow, unbound by predators who called themselves protectors. Merriwick Manor was abandoned. Locals swore its fields soured, its halls whispered. Travelers spoke of a man's shadow pacing the ruined foundations, calling softly, endlessly. Daughter, wife. Elizabeth died decades later, revered but haunted. At her grave, orphans laid flowers, never knowing the full weight she carried. And so the Caldwell name, once iron in Virginia's soil, rotted into silence. But the story endured, carried in whispers, of a man who tried to be both father and husband, and the girl who turned her cage into a courtroom, her wedding into a weapon. What do you think? Was Elizabeth's triumph justice enough? Or did Silas succeed in another way, leaving scars that even survival could not erase? Let me know in the comments, and remember, the darkest prisons are often built from trust, and the cruelest chains are written in ink.